this Author's Corner. I am your host, Alice Maria James, and today we will be speaking with Dr. Leanton Bracks, a retired professor and author with a wealth of knowledge on Black history and culture. It is a pleasure to be speaking with you today, Dr. Bracks. Welcome, Dr. Leanton Bracks. It is so wonderful to have you here on Read This. I love the title of your book, African American Almanac, 400 Years of Black Excellence. It is, that says it all. I would love for you to tell our audience just a little bit about yourself before we get into your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here on Read It with you. I am a retired professor of African American literature and African American studies, and this book that we're talking about today is a book that it's a second edition of a book that I did earlier. And as a retired professor of African American lit, I'd like to take that knowledge and move it forward. So I taught at Fisk University for 20 years, and I'd like to think that I have more to offer, even though I am retired.
Well, I think now without all the pressures of work, I know for me, I think that's when all the new ideas and the fruitfulness actually starts to come out, right? You're not so overwhelmed by the day-to-day responsibilities of life.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm curious about, well, I'm curious about a lot of things, but the people that you chose to highlight, and I say the people that you chose to highlight,
Mm-hmm.
but you highlighted so many people, even if they weren't necessarily the names that were listed as the people that have their segment. You talked about Richard Allen, Marcus Garvey. You started at 1619, and then you took us on a journey. I
Mm-hmm.
know you had a vast reservoir of people to choose from. How
Mm-hmm.
did you vet? How did you choose?
Well, I thought it was important, particularly in the overviews, to kind of give my reader a perspective from an African American who is an African American scholar. And I included those people that are most recognizable so that, my reader could feel like they could connect with some of the information surely by knowing a name or two. And then from there, I thought it was important to add people who had done things that were even more connected to the contemporary reader. I included people who folks would say, "Oh, I didn't know we did that." So someone who basically stepped into an area that we just never thought they did. Like someone, I think one of the most interesting ones, a contemporary person, was a young woman who came up with using beet juice in order to determine infection on sutures. And
Hmm.
she came
Hmm.
up with that because, she heard about women having babies in Africa and
Right.
with infections. And so someone like that, that's a young person who basically in science and who offered something that has long range effects. So it was the known, the inspirational, and the unexpected. I guess you
Okay.
could use
All
that as
right.
kind of a loose barometer.
But that
Hmm.
still gave you such a huge pool, and you pulled out some very phenomenal people to
Hmm.
highlight their stories. Um,
Hmm.
is there anything, what is the motivation for talking about a specific person? I think that's the kind of question
I
that
think Uh, they're individuals who basically started off with the African American experience solidly so, in terms
Mhm.
of there's a connection to the emancipation, Black people, and segregation. So their history has to connect to what is African American just on the ground level. And their work had to be inspirational in some way in terms of how I chose them. I think if people just pick an area that they choose, if you're interested in sports, you'll see those people but you'll see people that you may not have heard of or know about. Uh, it was kind of hard to decide who was in and who was out because I had so many names. And there are people in the first edition that aren't in the second edition. And I must admit, I had the book so large, my publisher said, this book is just, we have to cut back some.
Mhm.
So that was really hard trying to figure out, how I would kind of, lessen the number. Um, but they just had to be people who were solidly in our community, who did something that was beyond what we might have expected. And hopefully, people will look, there's like 12 areas in the book. So hopefully, people will look for the people who inspire them in the area of their interest. So if you're your actor and you read that particular section, and you're surprised to find that there are persons who were in the 1800s who were actors who had profound careers but somehow got lost by the time it came to the contemporary period. So it was kind of a juggling act trying to do all those things at the same time. So and there were people, I could have added even more and more, but I didn't want the biographies to overwhelm the information that precedes it, because
Mhm.
that was very important when I think about persons that, we don't have a lot of time because living day to day, there's so many things we have to do. But to be able to sit down and have a snippet of your history and be more informed so that other people won't tell you what happened in our history. As a
Oh,
as a professor, I know my students would come in kind of wide-eyed and going, well, so and so said that, that African people they enslaved people as well. I said, but you must understand that slavery has more than one definition, and that our history is a much more intense and a more brutal definition. And say, oh, well, I didn't quite understand that. So there are things that hopefully will empower us in knowing that won't take a lot of time to read that section, but hopefully inspire people to go and get more books, history books, and all kinds of things. So,
that's
hmm
what I found when I was looking through the book and doing the research is that um, it is a great launch pad for
hmm
you to like, oh wow, I want to know more about this. And as you said, because you have it divided into sections, if there is a section that interests you and you start reading about someone that you don't know, it gives you enough information that you can go and do a deeper dive. It's almost like a encyclopedia of like the who's who
hmm
in Black America, which I find it awesome. I seemingly have these conversations where people that say, "Oh, why is Black in front of everything?" And I said, because one, strictly if for no other reason, it's an identifier that allows us to find ourselves. Because if
hmm
I typed into Google poets, we would be
hmm
on page 10,000 of a million, or page 1
hmm
million. We would
Exactly.
not, unless you're the Maya Angelou's of the world and the
hmm
Langston Hughes, you're not going to show up. You're going to be so far behind. So, from
hmm
the standpoint of it's one, identifier, two, it allows us to be put in a place where we can be found. And
That's right.
that's what I love about this book is that you put so many people in a place to be found. You know the topic that you want to know about. I want to know about females in science. You have that topic in the book. People could find that topic in the book, and then they could find the females in science, the Black females in science. And
hmm
I feel that that's a wonderful benefit. Um, that's
hmm
just an awesome benefit right there.
uh-huh. hmm hmm
So, so when you were putting this together, how did that come together? What was the thought process that made that important to do it in that manner?
hmm Uh, Partly because when I think about, there are so many things that we're interested in as people, because initially, when we first get into education, the goal is that we're taught the things that, society says we need to know: reading, writing, arithmetic, and if you're lucky, you'll get culture. You go
Not
further into
ours.
education, and then your goal is to get the tools you need so you'll have a good life or
Mhm.
skill or career. And it's only after that point that you really kind of find where your interest happens to be. And so if education becomes that place where you see yourself in long term, then that section can speak to you in terms of past and present. If you see yourself as even as a historian, if you see yourself interested in science. And so, and for young people that may have a glimmer of what it is they might want to do, they've got choices in terms of the areas that they may want to look at in terms of what people did and people who are alive today who can kind of give them an example of how creative the world is. Hmm. And so, so that's kind of what I was thinking when I made those sections. There are 12 sections, and when it comes to performing, performance art and visual art, that was kind of a tough one since we are multi-talented. And so, in doing those particular areas, I had to really uh, work hard to allow people to be multi-talented because we're not monolithic. And so that was quite a challenge with all of those as well in terms of that. But just to give people a less of a catalog of areas to look through. And when you mentioned the issue about Black, I must say that one of the issues I had to contend with just even today is using Black as an identifier. And if you're Googling somebody now, you'll see that everybody is listed as an American. And so if you're looking at cultural connections for a lot of people, you won't be able to discover that unless you already know. And so
Exactly.
that has a tendency to limit our field as well. But Google no longer lends itself to African American, it's just America. It's not bad, but in terms of a cultural group that's trying to improve and increase their ability to operate in the world, having those cultural identifiers is important.
Yes,
Hmm.
it really is because even when I do put in the cultural identifier as Black,
Hmm.
and because I was looking for quotes
Hmm.
for my Instagram for say, and I put in, Black authors quotes. And
Hmm.
I got all of these authors quotes, and then as I'm reading through them, I'm like, wait a minute, this name sounds familiar. And I don't think this person's Black. And I
Hmm.
go in, and it's so diluted.
Right,
So to
right.
have this
Hmm.
book where that it's 100% what it says
Hmm.
it is, because
Hmm.
there's very few places where we can find ourselves kind of unadulterated, ourselves in our voice,
Hmm.
not someone else's voice, not
Hmm.
somebody's observation of us, but
Hmm. Hmm.
when you write about the people that you're writing about. Do you
Hmm.
believe that that matters, makes a difference? For me, it does, but I would like to
Hmm.
know how you feel about
In terms of giving them a voice,
it. Your voice,
oh,
another person of color speaking about this person of color versus someone
oh,
outside of the culture
hmm,
saying this is so and so and this is what they accomplished. Do you feel that
oh,
that makes a difference?
that is so crucial. That is so important. And that means that we have to be really careful about what we read and who writes it and what they say, and to be brave enough to ask questions. And when we offer, or people of African Americans who offer perspectives about our culture, we see something different. And a classic case of that is 1619 Project. Whereas you look at history from a Black perspective and you see things a little differently, and versus what we have been taught to see from a perspective of a very, very, very few. And so, talking about our culture and how it affects us, and having our voice and our narrative, not just one, but many voices within the culture speaking, then we have a clearer sense about who we are, where we've been, and the kinds of challenges we have every day, sometimes seen and sometimes not so easily seen. Then we have a better sense of that. So, having people who are like us, who look like us, who understand those what do they call them, micro kinds of approaches to who we are. I think it builds a confidence culturally about what's going on. So I think that's very, very important. Mhm.
Yeah, I do too. I've read stories and um, where on one hand, I'm happy to see somebody
Mm-hmm.
that wrote about this particular person, like, oh wow,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know this, and this person is
Mm-hmm.
now writing about them. But then when they put their perspective into it, when they put their experience on us, which is so different, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
uh
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't have worked 20-hour days, or
Mm-hmm.
that's not the norm, our norm is this, so that has to
Mm-hmm.
be their norm as well.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of things really upset me. so
Yes, I understand
so
that. Yeah, because you see that and you go, well, how did so and so come up with this particular perspective? Another classic case of that is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Of course, is everyone knows Uncle Tom's Cabin and the
Mhm.
stereotype that comes with that. But in the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, the character is very he concedes to everything that his master wants him to do. He's the typical slave at the time, just from the textbook, just from Beecher Stowe's perspective,
Yeah.
as a slave who was accommodating, who was basically submissive to all of the needs of their master. And in the story, even though he did things for his community, out of that, that stereotype was born. But the person who was the model for Uncle Tom was totally the opposite. But perspective becomes key in that. Josiah Henson is basically the person who was the quote unquote character for Uncle Tom. And Josiah Henson went with his master north in order to do some business dealings. And while he was north with his master got very ill. He had a young master. And so he stayed with him several months in a free state while his master healed. Well, of course, from the master's perspective, he's so loyal and dedicated, and all of these kind of overflowing emotional connections of loyalty in terms of him staying with his master while he was ill all those many months. Once his master was healed, business was done. Josiah Henson, i.e., Uncle Tom, came back to the plantation. So why didn't you run away? Even Dred Scott, tried to come up with some kind of solution for being in a free state. And as a result of that, what we find out when we hear Josiah Henson's story is that he didn't run away because his family was back on the plantation. He went home and eventually they did run away, but they ran away on their own terms, on their own time, in a way that made sure that all that were going with them were taken care of. And so you see two perspectives. One as an overindulgent and basically someone who was just so dedicated to that white master versus someone who was thinking about family and community and what was good for the whole and not just what was good for the one. And so that is just, what clearly says that, we have to have our own voice and tell our own story.
Yes,
Hmm.
yes. And thank
Hmm.
you for sharing that story. That so,
Hmm.
how do you see people utilizing this book in their life, and what's that vision for you?
Um, as a professor of African American literature, I've had students that come in over the years. I taught for like 20, almost 23 years. And I noticed early on, students would come in and they'd have a class or two in African American studies or maybe just a touch of history. And they would come in and they didn't really get the full picture, but they got something. But as time has gone by, students come to college and they may have had one class if they had any room in their schedule, or they may have only had the benefit of Black History Month. And so for students uh, and for parents and for anyone who's interested, the book serves as a way to know about our story over a broad scope because history does repeat itself. We see things that are new that are actually old. And if we don't have that panoramic view, then sometimes we think this is something brand new when it's really just got a new face on it. And I think during this time period, we're beginning to understand that there's a lot of older correlations to the life we're living today. And so the book becomes a resource for people to understand the journey that we as a culture have been on. and some of the pitfalls and the successes that Black folks have brought into the nation as a whole, not just our community, but the nation as a whole, and how those things have changed our circumstances and the circumstances of the nation. And so it became important that the book was for everyone. That I have a niece, and when I sent her a copy of the book, her mother said she picked it up and she really started reading the biographies. And
Mhm.
she enjoyed reading about different people doing all kinds of extraordinary things. She didn't get into the history part. And she's like 12, I think it is. And she began to read those parts. When I gave a book to my church, my pastor and his wife talked about reading that religious section because I'm Baptist, and so they read all the religious sections about all of the different AME and all the other churches that were developing once Black folks came into their own right as citizens. And so it serves as a resource even from when I think about the educational challenges that we had and how people dealt with how do Black people as educated people uh, look at themselves as educated, look as the group as a whole, how we stay connected, what has been done, the HBCU as a crucial part of that. And
Mhm.
so it becomes um, a beginning part to a lot of questions. The book should be ideally the book should be dog-eared. Pick it up, use it so much that the end begins to bend, whether
Mhm.
it be people or persons. I also think that, we assume, or the world assumes, that everybody has internet and that they can have it at their disposal when they feel like it, however they feel like it. And that is just not the case.
Yes.
And so if there is a book that can allow people to get that type of information for whether it be a report or whether it be just to fill in holes that the regular textbook at school don't provide. So it is meant to be used and to be useful. And so, I thought if I, as spending my years in academia, that is my greatest contribution, along with teaching some absolutely fantastic people along the way and students. So, hmm
I like that. It is meant to be used and meant to be useful. And
hmm
when I was
hmm
reading through and I saw I'm Baptist, but I lived in Philly for about a year and
hmm
I attended Mother Bethel.
hmm
And that's how come when I saw Richard Allen pop up in the history, I
hmm
that was the most enriching time as far as being around people that were so connected to the history and how the things that they created blossomed into what it has become. I
hmm
believe this book is an excellent, for lack of a better word, encyclopedia of people
hmm hmm
that
hmm
anyone can have an opportunity. And for those that say, well, the school doesn't want to teach this or that, or the other, this is a resource that you can use in your own home and choose what
hmm
you teach versus putting it
hmm
off on somebody else to teach what you want them to teach. So
hmm
I'm
hmm
thankful to you for utilizing your passion and your talent in that way.
hmm
What else is there? Is there anything else that you would like the audience to know about this book and how best to utilize it?
I guess it's important, I think, with the book that they kind of add to their own storehouse. After looking at the book, you see that the journey that I have been on in terms of creating the book and the history part and the individuals, but that we pay attention to people who, some of them who are not, media driven, but we pay attention to people who do good things that are good for our community, not just national news and all of this, but we keep in mind that their stories are important to be retold. We're a culture where the oral history has been our lifesaver and our rock. And often, sometimes we think that if it's not in the book, then it's not so. Well, with all the misinformation, we're reminded that we trust information that comes from people we trust.
Right.
and it's harder to find people we trust. So oral tradition for our community is really important. And so hopefully it will encourage us to think about those good things that people have done and the journeys that they've gone on and to share those things. Um, I might say when my son was coming up and I was away from my family, just he and I for a while. And in order to kind of bolster his sense of himself and his community, I would tell him stories about our family members. And, you know, none of them really did operate in the area that he was interested in, but they were people who did major things against the odds.
Right.
And so hopefully this will encourage people to tell their own stories along with the stories that they do know. And and if we don't tell those stories, of course, no one else will,
Exactly.
unless there's some mileage to be made by that someone else. And so just respecting our own perspective, our own story, and appreciating the fact that no matter what happens around us, that we still have some say, that we are not silenced, but that we have some say in the conversation. And we also choose who gets to listen to our conversations. We don't have to tell everybody everything. But we
That's
also get to choose that as well. We can choose our audience just as well. So I think those kinds of things is what would really like to kind of add along with just the book itself. And there goes my puppy.
that
Hmm.
that's a very good point, and I love the point where that you say that you don't have
Hmm.
to tell everybody everything. And I
Hmm.
learned that like many years ago from the standpoint that often you think you're telling someone something that is innocent, and then I saw people retelling something that I shared as if it was a story that they knew intimately, and
Hmm.
leaving out all the nuances, just
Right.
what they got from it.
Hmm.
And I was
Hmm.
just and I learned that I'm like, whoa, there's stuff that I won't share just because I don't want it co-opted or misunderstood. And I think that that's a very important point that
Hmm.
I see
Hmm.
now, and I share this now because
Hmm.
with what you're writing in the book, and
Hmm.
sometimes what I see on social media that kind of distresses me is how the younger generation might see their parents and the things that they're
Hmm.
putting out there based on the way they speak or the things how they act. And I
Hmm.
believe something like this, a book like this, where you
Hmm.
can get a snippet of history and try to get some empathy for what your parents or your grandparents might have gone through to make them the
Hmm.
way they are. You would not put out there a negative depiction of
Hmm.
the people that had raised you and did the best that
Hmm.
they could to give you a
Yeah.
better life than that they had.
Hmm.
So I see this book and to have so many layers, not
Hmm.
just the educational layer, but an
Hmm.
empathy layer, because
Hmm.
it's not something that's beating you over the head with someone's life was so bad, even though life was bad.
Hmm.
Look what we
Hmm.
accomplished. Look what
Hmm.
they accomplished. Look what we continue to accomplish against the odds.
Hmm.
So I have so much respect for your writing. In closing, is there anything else that you would like to add to what we've
Hmm.
discussed?
Hmm. Um, Let me say, just outside the realm of the book, is that it is such a has been an interesting journey with the book because I've been able to interview with people who have set about to offer community information, stories, people who are working toward goals and dreams and aspirations that you don't always know they're out there. And I salute you because it is not an easy task. And I am most appreciative that you are there so that I can do a better job at my job. because you're willing to take the risk and have the courage to do a good job at your job.
Oh,
So, I
thank
mean, it is very much appreciated.
Oh,
Hmm.
thank you. Thank you.
Hmm.
It was wonderful talking to you. I am
Hmm.
so happy that you were put on my radar um, by Raquel. And
Hmm.
I have moved things around because I definitely wanted your book to be the kickoff for Black History Month. I believe there's just so much value in what you've written. And I
Hmm.
love the resourcefulness and as large as it is, it's still compact compared
Hmm.
to trying to
Hmm.
hunt and peck to find this information online. So I
Yes.
love the fact that you have
Hmm.
made it compact enough to find the information. You have segmented it where people
Hmm.
can look in categories. You've done so many things right. So
Hmm.
I applaud you for that. And I thank you
Hmm.
so very much for taking the time to sit down and talk to me about your book.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
still like, I would love for you to come back and talk to me about the Black women of the diaspora. I think that's the name
Oh.
of the book, but that
Hmm.
I'm like, I, I have this itch that maybe we
Hmm.
can work out something for, I mean, women's history that we can
Oh,
talk about.
absolutely. Absolutely. And
Excellent. Excellent.
the diaspora also did a book on women of the Harlem Renaissance, so we can pick a
Yes.
period as well. So,
Yes,
hmm.
we could
Hmm.
probably, I would love to have
Hmm.
that conversation. Thank you
Absolutely.
so
Hmm.
much for your time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for being on Read This, and I
Mhm.
can't wait for us to do this again.
Me too. Me too.
It has been a great pleasure speaking with Dr. Bracks about her book, African American Almanac 400 Years of Black Excellence. Please go out and pick up a copy of her book. This should be in every household and taught to the next generation. Until next time, this has been Alice Maria James, and Read This. Keep reading, growing, and being empowered.